Shalom, good morning all. We are concluding Daniel chapters 10 to 12, which I shall do in two parts today and tomorrow, titled The Time of the Last Days and Proof that the Bible is Accurate. There is not much in these chapters regarding personal salvation except for these two verses. Daniel chapters 12 verse 2, which reads, "And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever." Now they remind me of the purpose of these studies, as it says in James chapters 5:20. "Let him know that he which converteth the sinner from the error of his way shall save a soul from death, and shall hide a multitude of sins." So as there is not much doing personal salvation, I am instead adding the third part of a study done in 2013 on the book of Daniel. Instead of my usual cutting and pasting in the actual verses of the chapters, I shall leave you to read the verses with the background below. On personal salvation, I would say, note that all legitimate prophets of God, as mentioned in the Bible, had access to Israel's or Judah's kings or religious leaders in order to influence the change in the nation's religious direction. For example, Samuel, Jeremiah, Isaiah. They all kept the commandments and laws of God, which included his holy days of Leviticus chapters 23. In the New Testament, the same criteria applied to apostles. When they spoke in tongues in Acts 2, it was also to influence and direct the nation's religious direction as prophesied by previous Old Testament prophets. There was no interpreter on that, nor the other two occasions where legitimate tongue speaking is mentioned, Acts 10:46 and 19 verse 6.
So as I said, they continued following the laws of God. Examples of this is in Acts chapters 2 verse 46, where it says, "And they continued daily with one accord in the temple." Acts chapters 3 verse 1, the times of prayer they met in the temple. Acts chapters 18 verses 4 and 25 verse 8 shows they were constantly attending on the Sabbath days as the appointed times of Leviticus chapters 23.
Neither did any of the Old Testament prophets nor New Testament apostles give themselves a title nor boast of their ability, as except in the case of 1 Kings chapters 13-18, where God was going to send a liar to the king. Compared to today, there are numerous Gentiles giving themselves individual titles of prophet or apostle. None to my knowledge keep the commandments of God, and definitely not his appointed holy Sabbaths of Leviticus 23. Do they qualify as prophets or apostles in God's eyes? Do they have access to Israel's leaders and can change Israel's destiny as the others did? I doubt it. As you read below, especially chapter 12, note it is all in reference to Daniel's, quote, "thy people." Literal Israel, not a spiritual replacement by Gentiles nor Gentile believers called Christians. Now, a summary of Daniel chapter 10, just to put you in perspective of it, is this. The third year of Cyrus is the king of Persia. Read this in verse 1. "A thing was revealed to Daniel. It was true. The time appointed was long. He understood the thing and had understanding of the vision. He is awake by a river Hiddekel with the other men, or some other men. But due to an earthquake or a quake, it says, that fell on them, the other men ran to hide, leaving only Daniel to see the vision of the man or the angel. The angel came to explain to Daniel what would happen to thy people in the last days. The angel was returning to fight with the prince of Persia and later the prince of Greece, which is the third empire to come. So Daniel chapter 10 verse 1 is a revelation that Daniel received in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, as I said, about 536 BC. It is Daniel's last vision, coming almost 3 years after that of chapter 9 verse 1. If Daniel was taken into Babylon in about 605 BC, this vision came almost at the end of the 70 years prophecy by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 25:11-12 and 29 verse 10. 2 years prior to this, a small group had returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, but were unsuccessful due to the poor work ethics of the temple. We read this in Ezra chapters 1 verses 1-4, verse 11, chapter 3 verses 1-3, and chapters 4 verse 1 and verse 24. You may recall my comment on chapter 9:25 in Daniel, which says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times." That this time began with the authority given to Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapters 2 verses 6-7, rather than when Ezra went back in Ezra chapters 1 verse 1. I should have put this point in with chapter 9, but forgot, so I will explain it here. Jeremiah talks of a prophecy that Judah will be in Babylon for 70 years. This was fulfilled in Ezra chapters 1 verse 1, which reads, "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh, the God of heaven, have given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. In fact, Cyrus permitted many of the Babylonian empire captives to return to their country of origin if they so wished. However, when we come to Daniel chapters 9:24 about a 70-week prophecy, this is a totally different prophecy with different start and end dates to that of Jeremiah and Ezra. The start date of this one, as mentioned in 9:25, is with Nehemiah, and the end dates of the sections of sevens were explained when I did chapter 9. Their ends relates to the Messiah in chapter 9 verse 26, which says, "And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off." Lastly, neither of these prophecies have anything to do with the 2,300 evening and mornings of Daniel chapters 8 verse 14, regarding the pollution and cleansing of the temple, except they are related to the people of Judah. The background to this is given in chapter 11. So back to Daniel chapter 10 verse 1, which states, "The thing revealed is true, although the appointed time is long in the future. However, Daniel understood the thing and had understanding of the vision." Remember, the narrative in our Bibles is in language order, not chronological. Remember, some of the language was written in Aramaic and some in Hebrew, meaning the events as told from a controlling Gentile point of view, and then in Hebrew as they affect the Hebrews. The 4 visions that make up the final part of Daniel's book, chapter 7 to 12, fall into chronological order, just as the narratives of chapters 1 to 6 did. Thus, chapters 7 and 8 came in the first and third years of Belshazzar's reign, which belong chronologically between chapters 4 and 5 in the narrative section. Likewise, chapter 9 and 10 to 12 came in the first and third years of Cyrus's reign, so they came later than the time of the narrative in chapters 1 to 6. The last 3 chapters of Daniel, broadly speaking, fall into 3-part structure. 1. A prologue in chapters 10 verses 1 to 19. 2. A report of the vision in chapters 10 verses 20 to chapters 12 verses 4. And 3rd, an epilogue in chapters 12 verses 5 to 13. The vision was like a reality with sight and sound, in the sense of something visually seen and heard. It came as a revelation, meaning uncovering of something that was hidden, as a message to Daniel, possibly because God knew from Daniel's prayer his concern for his people. Verse 2, Daniel was mourning and fasting 3 full weeks, which is 21 days. You can read the vision of its effect on Daniel at your leisure. The self-denial he underwent included not oiling his skin in the heat of that country and parallels sackcloth and ashes used by others in similar times when they petitioned God. In verse 5, he sees a man clothed in white linen, the attire of a priest, which we see in Exodus chapters 28 verse 5, 39 and 42. Also in Ezekiel chapters 9 verses 2 to 3, Revelation chapters 15 verse 6. It is said that this was no ordinary angel, not even one as Gabriel, but a pre-incarnation of Yahushua, the Son of Man, as it says. Due to similarities with Revelation chapters 1 verses 13 to 16. Some of the identifying descriptions as 1. A belt of the finest gold around his waist. This is in chapter verse 5. Is similar to, which quotes, with a golden sash around his chest of Revelation chapters 1 verses 13. Second, his eyes were like flaming torches. Verse 6 is similar to his eyes were like brazen fire in Revelation chapters 1 verse 14. Third, his legs like the gleam of burnished brass, verse 6, and that is similar to his feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace of Revelation chapters 1 verse 15. And fourthly, his voice like a sound of multitude in verse 6 of Daniel is similar to his voice like the sound of rushing waters in Revelations 1 verse 15. Some say it is not Yahushua because the angel is missing the sword, i.e. of Revelations 1 verse 6 and Isaiah chapters 49 verse 2 and Ephesians chapters 1 verse 7.
Ephesians chapter 6 verse 17. Now whilst I'm here, I'll just go over quickly a PowerPoint I did on another point of Revelations, also mentioned in Daniel, to do with his head and his hairs being white like wool. I think the reference is Daniel chapter 7 verse 9 and Revelations chapter 1 verse 14. Now there is a group of people that would like you to focus on Revelation 1:14 on the head of hair. 1:14 says his head and his hairs were white like wool, and his eyes wool as white as snow. And they would like you to focus on this 2 attributes of whiteness and woolliness. And that is the picture they normally put up on the internet for you. Now, when we understand Scripture, we sometimes don't get everything in one place. So I'll just give you an example. We have to put line upon line and precept upon precept. So, for example, as to when Yeshua rose from the dead, and so forth. If we go to in the Bible, the Gospels, the apostles tell the same account but with different information. Only by putting all accounts together do we get the full description of events, i.e. when Yeshua rose from death, or how many people went to the tomb and how early they went. So the scriptures that tell us the bits of these stories is John chapter 20 verse 1, the first day of the week, which people think is Sunday, but it's not Sunday. We'll come on to that in a minute. Cometh Mary Magdalene early, when it was yet dark. So that's the first indication. It was yet dark, the first day of the week. The first day of the week starts the end of the Sabbath, which is the end of what we call Saturday night, sunset. So sunset is 6 p.m. The first day of the week starts at 6:01 p.m. The next scripture we have is Luke chapter 24 verse 1. That says, now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came to the sepulchre bringing the sepulchre. So we have it was dark and it was very early in the morning part of the day. If you go to Genesis chapter 1 verses 3, 5 and 8, it tells you about the evening and the morning, so forth. The next verse we have is Matthew chapter 28 verse 1. In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn, towards the first of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see them. So the Sabbath had just finished and it began to dawn. So we have it is yet dark, it is very early, and it's beginning to dawn. The last one is Mark chapter 16 verse 1. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, had brought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came into sepulchre at the rising of the sun. So now we have put all those things together. It was dark, it was early towards dawn, and the sun was just about to rise. So now let's put that same concept into understanding Revelation chapters 1 verse 14. We have, the Bible is about black men, so they'll like you to think. But so I've got some people would like you to see white like wool in both colour and texture of the hair, but they do not read into the words clothing was as white as snow. They don't say that means the clothing was cold or dissolves in heat like snow does, or any other attributes apart from its colour, white. Yet they want to attribute two attributes to white like snow. Now if we have a sentence that says something, for example, his hair was green like grass, do we look at two things, the colour and the texture like grass? No, we don't. We just look at this lady's hair. The hair is green like grass. Yes? You look at the colour. You do not look at two attributes, colour and texture, or any other similarities to the grass apart from its colour. So let's apply that now to Revelations 1:14. That says his head was, let's go back to what it says, his head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow. So to focus on the hair and forget the head and hairs. So if we look at head and hairs, and they want to do it their way, does head and hair white like a unicorn mean that the person has a head like a unicorn? I think no. Yes, he's just talking about the colour of the person. His head and his hairs were white. So how do we get what is a head and hair white looking like? Here we have it. For example, Revelation 1:14, his head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow. Again, many people go outside the sentence and focus only on the hairs and wool to read their desired outcome into the sentence, which clearly says his head and something else was white. Does that mean we read two attributes into the head, i.e. it was as the images below? So we have some pictures below here with the head and his being white. And this case I use it as a horse. We don't look at it as being curly, but curly as wool. We don't look at it as being curly. It means to send the verse, head and his white like wool, but it doesn't mean his face is curly or has curly hairs on it. What's the next picture? Here we have a white horse, his head, but hairs of another colour, say brown or whatever you want to call that. Yes, so that doesn't meet the criteria of head white and his white. This will say his head was white and his hairs was brown, for example, is the sentence. Now here's a picture, which I can't see if I can enlarge it, of a woolly head. These are elephants that has a woolly head. Yes? So if you want to say his head was woolly, then that's what it would be. So my point is, we cannot follow what the interpretation people when they read into the Bible. So again, another picture of a white head and hair. His head and his hairs was white like wool. Both things are white. So could this actually be what the scripture is saying? It fits. Revelation, his head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow. Daniel 7:9, Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and his hairs of his head like the pure wool. What have we got here? This one goes into the other thing they talk about, Revelation 1:14, and his feet like unto fine brass. I'll leave you to pause your video and go into this. Fine brass does not talk about burnt. They used to think it was as if burnt in a furnace. This, if you look at the Strong's, it tells you it's whiteness. Burnt in a furnace doesn't mean it comes out black. It means it's a process. When you burn glass, sand in a furnace, it turns out to be glass. When you burn clay in to make your plates and your cups and all those kind of clay things, they don't come out black. They come out like, what clay does, the colour of the plate. Yes, brownish. Yes, so they are really not reading the scripture, or not reading out of the scripture, they're reading into the scripture. So let's get back to my Daniel, where we were.
Verse 12 says that Daniel's prayer were heard from the first day he sought understanding and chastised himself before God. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood the messaging angel from arriving the 21 days, until Michael, one of the chief prince angels of God, came to help him, and the messaging angel who was sent remained there with the king of Persia. Now the angel has come to make Daniel understand what will be his people. So what will happen to his people in the latter days? In verse 20, the angel says he will return to fight the prince of Persia, and when he is gone, the prince of Greece shall come. We read in chapter 8, verse 20, the changeover between the Persian and Greek Empire took place. The earlier chapters of Daniel described his visions of things that were previously seen. He now begins an introduction to the last two visions that were given to him. Visions of things that will be. These visions are more fully described in chapters 11 and 12. In these visions, God tells Daniel exactly what will happen in the future between certain teams and nations to show that he, God, is in full control. The fact that Daniel saw and wrote about this vision during the 3rd year of Cyrus of Persia does not contradict Daniel chapters 1 verse 21, which states he continued onto the 1st year of Cyrus. Daniel 1:21 implies that Daniel would continue until the commencement of the new kingdom, which would be ruled by the Persian king Cyrus. Not that he would die at that time. See also Isaiah chapters 44 verse 28 and 45 verse 1. It may also mean that Daniel would no longer hold a position of power he did in the Babylonian Empire, especially with the jealous other magicians trying to have him killed in the lion's den, etc. Daniel 11 continues from Daniel 10. So on to Daniel 11, a summary being. The chapter opens, I am told, with the angel who was speaking at the end of chapter 10, continuing in speech. He adds that in the first year of Darius the Mede, who took over from Babylon at the end of chapter 5, it was he, the angel, that stood to confirm the transfer of the kingdom from Babylon to Medes and to strengthen Darius. The angel goes on to explain the truth behind the events. He stated at the end of chapter 10 that he was returning to fight the prince of Persia, and after that shall Greece arise. He explains what will happen between these two events, i.e. how the kingdom will transfer from the second empire to the third. 3 kings shall stand up in Persia. A fourth will be far richer than the others, and he shall use the strength gained from his riches to make war with Greece. But a great king of Greece shall stand up against him and rule as he wills. This being Alexander the Great, the he-goat of chapter 8 verse 5. After the empire changed, and after the death of Alexander, out of his kingdom will arise 4 kings ruling 4 divisions of the empire. We see this in chapter 11 verse 22 and chapter 8 verse 8. The 4 regions being, say, the north, south, east and west. Chapter 11 verse 4 ends with a proclamation that the third empire will also be plucked up. Chapter 11 verses 5 to verse 45 focuses on 2 of these 4 divisions. Here, when the phrase king of the north or south is used, it does not refer to a particular king, but generations of kings from those regions, those kingships, who continue to fight as their fathers did. The southern and northern kingdoms, which at times were at war with each other, tried to strike a peace deal through intermarriages, but this does not last. Jerusalem was in the middle of this inter-empire fighting from the north and the south, as they fought for its control Jerusalem, that is. Some of the inhabitants of Jerusalem tried to decide the outcome of this battle by joining with one side or the other. In the King James Version, they are referred to in verse 14 as the robbers of thy people. Robbers, which is a Hebrew word bain, with a Hebrew numerical identification of 1121, stands for a tyrant or a violent person, and thy people, which has a Hebrew word identification of 5971, means a small section within a larger group of a nation. So what we have is a small group trying to make allegiances with either the north or the south on behalf of Jerusalem. Daniel 11 is a narrative of the exploits of these 2 kingships, the north and the south. The wordings of verse 31, take away daily, place of abomination that make it desolate, and verse 36, magnify themselves, can also be found in chapters 8 verse 11. These relate to actual events of chapter 8 verse 11 of Antiochus Epiphanes as one of the tyrants of Jerusalem, and his exploits are expanded in the book of the Maccabees, who were an Israelite family of that time who cleansed the temple. These books, of a similar nature to the book of Esther, telling part of Israel's history, but were not included in the present 66 books of the Bible compiled when it was compiled, but they were in the original compilation of that made up the Bible. So read the book of Maccabees. You can get it on the internet or you can listen to it. The chapter ends in verse 45 with the kingship of the south coming to an end with no one able to help him. Of course, all things are orchestrated by God, who hardens hearts or allows man to harden their own heart in order to fulfill his prophecies. So that's a broad summary of Daniel chapter 11. A bit more specifically, Daniel 11 tells the account of Gentile empires and wars involved in Jerusalem. A. The prophecy about Persia in chapter 11 verse 2. B. The prophecy about Greece in verse 3. C. The prophecy about the king of the south and the king of the north in chapter 11 verses 5 to 20. And D. The prophecy of the last king of the south in chapter 11 verses 21 to 35. E. The prophecy about the willful king in chapter 11 verses 36 to 45. The kings of the north or south means the direction and kings from which the invasions on Jerusalem would come. Daniel 11 elaborates on the prophecies given in chapter 8. Remember, unlike some parts of Daniel, both chapters were written in Hebrew to show it related specifically to them. This vision sets a detailed account of the Gentile empires as they would seek to conquer and rule over Israel, God's set-apart land. Empire attacks come from the north and south of Jerusalem. The angel of chapter 10 continues speaking into chapters 11 and 12. One of the reasons we know this is the white attire of the angel that appeared to him while at the river in chapters 10 verses 2 to 5 and also chapters 12 verse 6. In chapter 11 verses 2 to 4, he foretells how the empires would change over from the Medes to the Greeks, as told in Daniel chapters 8 verses 3 to 9, i.e. the rise of Alexander the Great, his succeeding 4 generals and their fall, and makes no mention of the Roman Empire because it hadn't come yet. In Daniel's visions of chapters 2 and 7, the Roman Empire was included, though not by name, along with those of Babylon, Mede, Persians and Greece. Why is the name Rome not mentioned in chapter 12? Why is it omitted in chapter 11? Because it does not deal with the end times of the world, a phototype of the Antichrist as some think, but a specific period, future to Daniel, but past to us now, because we now know the Fourth Empire is Rome. Some theologians use the main character of Daniel 11 as a phototype of the Antichrist. The character being Antiochus Epiphanes, who came out of the Syrian Greek Empire. He thought he was greater than God, magnified himself, and did abominable things to the sanctuary, as explained in Daniel chapters 8 verses 11 to 14. The emphasis of the vision and prophecies of chapter 11 is on this satanically controlled Gentile ruler over Israel. It therefore only details events leading up to the rise of power and ultimate defeat of this ruler, the last Greek. Rome is not mentioned because these events predate Rome. Antiochus Epiphanes lived and died before Rome controlled Israel. In fact, we do not see Rome ruling Israel until the New Testament. Prior to then, Israel succumbed to idol worship in the Old Testament. 400 years between the last page of the Old Testament, Malachi, and the first page of the New Testament, i.e. Malachi to Matthew, this 400 years, that's not covered in our Bible. We see, by the time we come to the New Testament, we see that Israel have overcome this temptation of idol worship. The history between those 2 pages explains why. In other words, the history, Israel went through so much punishment and catastrophes that they learned not to worship false gods. So by the New Testament, they are zealous to keep God's ways, commandments, and they've actually made it worse by putting harsh things on people. Actually, they can't carry their beds, they can't do this, they can't wash their hands, they can't do this, they can't do that. In other words, they're brought in traditions to try and keep the people on the straight and narrow. So it was Israel's rejection of God and his laws that set in motion the events that
brought about the change for the New Testament. So we'll continue part 2 tomorrow. Hope this has been very informative, especially the Revelation chapters 1 verse 14 part. Shalom, until tomorrow, God willing.